These Nogai tribes, generally referred to just simply as Tatars, are the subject of much attention in the history of Ukraine. Now, theoretically, these various Nogai tribes were expected to recognize the authority of the Crimean Khan, usually in the form of a representative that the Khan sent from Bakhchisarai. But in practice, the Nogais usually followed their own whims and often rebelled against the Crimean Khanate. And yet, as one historian remarked, specifically Alan Fisher, quote, the Nogais served a useful purpose for the Crimean Khanate. Why? They prevented the establishment of solid Slavic settlements in the steppe, and they provided the Crimean slave markets with a never-ending supply of slaves. In fact, by the early 16th century, the early 1500s, the Crimean economy had come to be based largely on the slave trade. The slave trade. Now, slavery was legal according to Islamic law, but only persons from outside the Muslim world could be enslaved. So non-Muslims. And therefore, captives taken in wars against non-Muslim powers, these were the prime candidates for slavery. Now, while slaves formed an integral part of the Ottoman Empire's socioeconomic system, and that includes also the Crimean Khanate, that same system, that same society allowed for various forms of manumission, that is, freeing slaves, both for slaves and their offspring. And that led to a situation, since many of them could be freed, the empire was in constant need of replenishing slaves. And before long, the Ottomans' new vassal state, the Crimean Khanate, became the primary source of slaves. Crimea as the primary source of slaves. And so in practice, when, from the standpoint of the Crimean world and their operating, whenever there was a downturn in agricultural productivity, the Khanate, the state, could supply its income with profits earned from selling slaves. Now, just to the north of the Nogai steppe were those non-Muslim world whose inhabitants could be enslaved. And therefore, captives taken in wars against those non-Muslim powers were, in fact, the vast majority of the slaves that entered into the larger Ottoman and Crimean system. It was there that the Tatars from Crimea turned in search of Christian Slavs to enslave. Now, the Tatars, whether the cavalry of the Khan's armies or the Nogais, who we're going to see the primary slave raiders, they entered the lands of Poland, Lithuania via several invasion routes that began at a place called Perikop. I can't remember if we had this on our map exam, but it's an important place, Perikop. The Crimea is not an island, it's a peninsula, but it's attached only by a tiny little sliver of land, very important today in the war, to the mainland of Ukraine, right here. And so there was a Crimean fortress at Perikop, and it's from there that these various routes were used to raid, slave raiding routes, so to speak. The Crimean Khanate's military forces, which were almost exclusively cavalry, ranged in size from about 10 to 30,000 in the 16th century. The Nogai slave raiding parties, much smaller, but their incursions, because they were much smaller, more frequent, with the result that the number of captives that they managed to acquire was actually quite astonishing. Some scholars have estimated that on average 20,000 captives from Poland, Lithuania each year alone, with the total number of captives from the period, let's say 1500 to 1664, reaching about 1 million people. Incredible numbers.